So I am Diane Kriz, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of History of Art and Architecture here at Brown. So welcome to the afternoon session. We will go until 4 o'clock. And the format will be the same as this morning for any of you that weren't here. We will have a speaker, some discussion, move on to the next panelist, more discussion, and then at the end, hopefully a wrap-up discussion. I'm going to let Tony and Jerry take their seats so we should have our supervisors. So I think it's entirely fitting that there be a session of this conference devoted solely to the visual arts, given the centrality of aesthetics, art, and visual culture more generally to the production of a colonial and racial imaginary. An imaginary that, as Stuart Hall pointed out years ago, has real material effects. To give just one example, the ancient sculpture of the Greeks and Romans, redeployed in the late 1700s, was absolutely central to the formation of so-called scientific racism in Western Europe. And visual images across a range of media and genres, from cheap caricatures and natural history illustrations to high-status oil paintings and photographs, all contributed to the project of naturalizing slavery and, importantly, and this is a theme that we'll pick up from this morning, producing its legacies. But as the title of this session suggests, the visual arts have also been important vehicles for the creation of a liberatory counter-imaginary that makes visible and thereby helps create the conditions for freedom. In exploring the project of envisioning freedom, we are fortunate to have such an amazing panel of speakers today. The politically engaged and innovative scholarship that they have produced is varied in the objects that are analyzed, the questions posed, and in the sheer geographical reach of the work. And interestingly, this scholarship is enriched by the fact that all three of them are accomplished practitioners of art as well as scholars, something I admire deeply as somebody who's a practitioner of nothing at all except writing. So our first panelist is Marcus Wood, who is professor of English at the University of Sussex in the UK, but his contributions extend well beyond the analysis of written texts. He is an artist who works in a number of media, including film, painting, and performance. And as far as I'm concerned, he has more than earned his stripes as an art historian. In numerous books and articles, he offers sensitive, searching, and critical analyses of objects ranging from postage stamps to oil paintings. So I'll mention here only two of these publications. First, his book, Blind Memory, Slavery and Visual Representation in England and America, published in 2000, truly was a game changer, opening up a whole field of study of the visual culture of slavery, particularly within the domain of what one would call maybe the Black North Atlantic. 2002 saw the publication of Professor Wood's The Horrible Gift of Freedom, Atlantic Slavery and the Representation of Emancipation. It's a scholarly critique of the perverse but very powerful idea that freedom is something that can actually be bestowed as a gift. In the process of deconstructing this idea, he shows how historical narratives of African slavery have become narratives of white abolition that continue into the present. Much of Professor Wood's scholarship has focused fairly heavily on Britain and its American colonies, but tonight we'll have the opportunity to attend a launch of his newest book, which extends his analysis to the Southern Hemisphere. The book is entitled Black Milk, Imagining Slavery in the Visual Culture of Brazil and America, and the launch will take place at the Brown Bookstore at 5:30 p.m. I suspect, although I'm not sure, that we are about to be treated to a slight preview of that book now, since the title of Professor Wood's remarks are Exploding the Diasporic Archive, Meditations on Art, Slavery, Brazil, and the Limits of Cultural Memory. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wood.
Yeah, I was explicitly told not to give a formal paper today, so I've kind of stood by that demand. And what I'm going to do is talk to a series of images. They're not actually any of them images which come from the book, which is I'm going to be talking about tonight. Black Milk, visual representations of slavery in North America and Brazil. I'll be giving a talk this evening where I do address some of that imagery. But I've been working on that book for about 25 years on and off in terms of bouncing between Brazil and North America and trying to think through various complicated questions relating to the legacies of slavery. Sorry, just took on the time. The legacies of slavery and how very different they are within those two enormous diasporic cultures. I'd begun really, I suppose, as I never know what I am. I never know if I'm an art historian, a cultural historian, an artist who dabbles with the interpretation of imagery. God knows. But I'd certainly worked as a conventional archivist a lot of my life up until the engagement with this book, Black Milk. And it was towards the end of writing that I suddenly started to think about limitations of the archive and the diaspora, about how maybe we mustn't just be confined by a paper archive, by objects arranged in certain ways and organised in certain ways by the people who officiate over and govern how our cultural legacies of slavery operate. In part, that's because that archive is primarily a white-dominated and a white-generated archive. If you focus on that too much, Hilary was talking today about legacy, opening up legacy. Very important question. Well, if you restrict how you're going to think about the diaspora and how it functions as cultural communication through the conventional academic archive, things are kind of badly weighted, I suppose, against the slave. We had a number of speakers today saying how incredibly important it was to start thinking about and uncovering, in any way we could, individual slave consciousness, individual slave legacy, the manner in which black cultures within the diaspora have managed to maintain and proliferate their own cultural responses to slavery, which might be profoundly different from those legitimated and controlled by the white archive, if you want to put it that way. So I started working on this project, which the images I'll be looking at relate to, where we basically thinking about how can we possibly explode the conventional archive. Can you? If you're going to, where do you look? And when you start looking in these areas, which are unconventional and are not confined to art museums and to libraries or to databases, how on earth do you start developing an aesthetics of exploration for this material, or an ethics of exploration for this material, and what do you do with it? So what I'm going to throw at you today are a series of images which have histories behind them, and which I'm thinking about working through in this book, Exploding Archives. I'm going to kind of give you the background and some thoughts as to why they're relevant and why I'm going into these areas, in the hopes that that will just kind of generate some thoughts in your minds and hopefully some responses which, in the long run, will not only generate a useful discussion today, but which might help me with the methodological decisions about the new direction my work's taking. I need the remote. Yeah, this first one, 25 years ago I went to Brazil and I stayed in a house below the flat-top mountain in Rio de Janeiro with a guy who was then the head of British Aerospace, which was basically a government arms trading company really run by the British, which was called British Aerospace. So he was basically an official arms dealer for the British government, and he lived in this enormous fortress guarded by dogs, and the whole thing was stratified. The top floor of the house was where all the white people lived, and we were kind of locked up there. The second floor was where we they were bedrooms, and the second floor was the social space. The third floor was where all the house slaves, or should I say house servants, lived. It was very much a kind of casa grande structure. And the basement was where the dogs and the gardeners and all the domestics who lived in the garden operated. And so upstairs, there was one dog allowed in the house, which is this dog, she was called Carioca, who I got very close to at my first trip to Brazil. She's actually a dog called a Fila Brasileira, Fila Brazilian verb meaning to hold. These dogs were bred explicitly to have qualities to allow them to run through the jungle, hunt down slaves, and then hold them down. They're a breed that's banned in Europe, actually. A cross between a bulldog, a bloodhound, and a mastiff. Very intelligent, very fierce, if trained properly. This dog was actually trained on a kill word to protect this woman inside the house. So if this word was announced, the dog would literally tear you apart. I was talking to Hillary in the limousine on the way in last night about Django Unchained, which he's a big fan of, the new Tarantino film. And he was saying that the scene in it, which in some ways he thought was most courageous, was of the slave being torn apart by dogs, and how cleverly edited that was in terms of these very violent flashbacks that keep coming back to you and back to you. And then we started thinking about the whole position of the dog, the slave dog within slave culture. I mean, Marcus Rediker wrote a book, The Slave Ship, and it was the first book ever written to think, what was a slave ship? How do you culturally reconstruct a slave ship? Most ships weren't actually built as slave ships, so what do you do with that? Well, it's similar with the slave dog. I mean, there hasn't been a cultural history of the slave dog. What do you do with the slave dog? How did it function? In Brazil, you have specific dogs, Fila Brasileiros, which did operate as slave dogs. In other diasporic cultures, you didn't. If slaves ran away, you probably grabbed whichever dogs were to hand. So I don't know, I just started thinking when I was in Brazil, what do we do with the inheritance of the dog? We have a specific kind of dog, the Fila Brasileira, now mainly owned by rich white people to police their lives and protect their property, which came out directly from the inheritance of Atlantic slavery. A dog which was also, I suppose, a kind of social stitch in the fabric of the house between, it was sort of the only living thing which everybody talked to and everybody interacted with emotionally, because the social stratifications between the whites, the house servants, and the servants outside, in many ways couldn't be mediated, but it could be mediated by the dog. So I don't know, one thing I've started to think about is, can we write, or is there any point trying to write, a cultural history of the slave dog? Would it be a useful thing to do? I wanted to kind of quickly think about problems I have with the heritage industry, social heritage and slavery. I'm going way too slowly here, so I'd better speed up. Colonial Williamsburg is a thing I'm working on. I got fascinated by it. Full of English flags, and full of African Americans now who are playing the part of being slaves in character. So for those of you who haven't been to Colonial Williamsburg, you go in there, you try and talk to one of these people and say good day to them or something, and they'll start addressing you in terms of how they've just been reading John Wilkes and what do I think about, kind of freedom in America and so on and so forth, in character. The whole thing's very, very peculiar. It's a, I don't know if this is working. Yeah, Colonial Williamsburg is a kind of Disney historical fantasy created by Rockefeller money. The actual extent of, the number of buildings which have anything authentic left in them is very, very tiny. So it's kind of an authentic forgery of a slave city. You have slave stocks outside the courthouse. You have tourists who bring their children along and pose them inside these things, including African American children. Again, it kind of history, memory tools. Which are the right ways? Which are the wrong ways of remembering slavery? I got deeply disturbed the morning I was watching a parade of young children sitting in these things, often being asked to sit in them to have their photographs taken by their parents, and thinking, what's the cultural meaning of that? How do these hideous objects, which operated as torture tools and now exist in these public spaces, operate as memory tools? And if you put a child in a stocks like that, what on earth do you think their intellectual or emotional position with regard to recovering the trauma of slavery is, or should be? I found it deeply disturbing. That's one taken in Minas Gerais of a kid on a school trip trying on slave stocks. In fact, those slave stocks are a thing called the tronco, enormous slave stocks that were used in Brazil, and your legs would have got to do that, so his arms would never actually have been in the stocks at all. But there he was, I snapped him, doing some kind of, I don't know, was this immersion history? Is this kind of taking us back to the pain that slaves felt when a young Afro-Brazilian forces himself into a situation like that and starts performing in front of his friends? I don't know sometimes what to do with these things. Fetishization, martyrology, is another thing that I'm kind of deeply concerned with. The way we can invest objects, precious objects, with a kind of fetishized and martyrological value, which completely superscribes the true history of slavery. This is the golden, when it says the pen with which the Princess Regent, Princess Isabella, signed the law, the golden law that is, which declared the extinction of slavery in Brazil. If you go to the Royal Palace in Petropolis, you can see this pen in a glass case. You can see Afro-Brazilian families kneel down and cross themselves, say prayers in front of it, weep in front of it. Princess Isabella is still worshipped as a cultural icon, with the kind of intensity, I think, which goes way beyond the emotional investment of African Americans in President Lincoln. But what do you do when certain specific objects like that get invested with an enormous fetishistic weight? Again, are they useful memory tools? Are they very dangerous memory tools? That's one of the three apparent emancipation inkwells in which Lincoln dipped his emancipation pen, which again have become totally fetishized objects. The very fact, it's a bit like the cross, isn't it? Apparently if you added up all the fragments of wood which claim to be in Catholic reliquaries, which constitute the Christian cross, I don't know how many tons of wood it would make, but an awful lot. And it's a bit similar with this Lincoln memorabilia, which proliferates across the States. But when you actually invest this much in martyrology, where are you led to? And the cult of personality. This is kind of a very curious object. You probably won't guess what it is. It was in a thing called the Dime Museum in Baltimore. It's, if you look at the small object in the center of the oval case, you've got a gnu's head on the left, a case of strange nuts on the right, a narwhal's tusk underneath. Then in the middle, you have this object which purports to be, which purports to be President Lincoln's final turd. Recovered from Ford's Theatre, signed by Samuel Frick. In fact, the whole thing in the end turned out to be a forgery, but the very fact it was made and put in a case in a museum, I mean, you can see it as just an absurd, bad practical joke, but you could also see it maybe as an installation piece which asks quite difficult questions about, how far do you take the cult of personality? This thing presents itself as a great emancipator's final coprolite. What do you do with that? And if you are going to start investing yourself in the complete fetishized worship of the memorabilia surrounding heroes of abolition, what are the limits? Should there be limits? In a similar vein, this is the Monticello, the slave dependencies in Monticello. Very disturbing, I think, in terms of, again, if we're thinking about opening up the legacies of slavery, maybe the locus classicus, the great watershed in terms of finding a terrifying focus for the conflicting memory of slavery and the founding fathers of America has got to be the inheritance of Jefferson. If you go to Monticello, you have these things called the so-called slave dependencies, tunneled out underground, where the slaves at Monticello lived. The way that they're sort of presented to you on the tourist map, you'll see there's no mention of these actually being slave quarters at all. That little strip that says restrooms at the end. Restrooms is a highly significant detail, actually, in that illustration, as you'll see, because when you look at the actual, not the big tourist map, which is that one, but when you look at the sort of more learned text, which discusses the actual architectural layout of it, there you see it does say slave quarter, slave quarter. That little arrow that you saw in the previous image, that said restrooms, that little arrow that points in, you'll see that slave quarter. Then if you do serious research into Jefferson's, hang on. This thing's being temperamental. Yeah, if you do serious research into Jefferson's letters, correspondence, and note-taking, you'll find that the room that is now labelled ladies, a restroom in other words, a woman's restroom, but it's in fact a slave quarter, is the one room in the entire main buildings of Monticello that hasn't been basically revamped and kind of excavated and reset out according to museological principles. It's been turned into a ladies' restroom, but that in fact is the bedroom that Sally Hemings used and which she probably slept in with Jefferson. So why has it been turned into that? When in the rest of the building there's been meticulous standards observed with regards to exactly how each of the rooms should be reconstituted. And you're like the dairy is like a dairy, the kitchen's like a kitchen. The other slave restrooms have been created as slave cabins. Why is the one room which Sally Hemings slept in a woman's restroom? And of course, Jefferson himself had a very different idea about what he regarded, what he thought his legacy might be. That's his design for his own obelisk. And that you can see about half a mile away from what I suppose I regard as the kind of institutional legacy of Sally Hemings, which is her restroom. Maybe it should be called the Sally Hemings restroom. Finally, I just wanted to quickly think about another area I'm working on is beads, bead cultures. If we haven't got a proper history of slavery and the slave dog, we certainly don't have a proper history of, and maybe no one will ever be in a position to write a proper cultural and material and aesthetic history of the movement of and the importance of African bead cultures and of bead trading between Europe and Africa. And the slave diaspora, particularly in terms of how, if we're thinking about this crucial question of legacy and of the legacy of individual slaves, the Middle Passage, very few slaves managed to bring property across. And yet, the major exception to that fact is an awful lot of slaves, and you can see from photographs of them when they're just landed in Brazil, in the 1840s and 1850s, that did manage to bring beads along with them. And there's this kind of cliche, isn't there, that the slave trade was about cannon shot and glass beads, and that beads represent, you can buy a woman for a 6-inch nail and 3 strings of beads or something. The kind of cliches which surround bead culture are outrageous, in fact. When you think that what we're talking about are profoundly complex aesthetic traditions within African cultures, closely linked to religious ceremony and religious ritual, and that Africans made European bead traders understand what kind of beads they liked, and why they wanted certain kinds of beads, why they'd buy certain kind of beads. For example, with the crow when girls pass through puberty and become sexually mature, they always have to wear strings of carnelian beads. If you go to Brazil now, you can still buy carnelian beads, both real carnelian beads and this one I bought, which is a large Czechoslovakian, but a very old carnelian trading bead. And the young women in the Shamba cult in Olinda still have these beads tied on them when they pass through puberty. Similarly if you're talking about beads and aesthetics, these things are called millefiori beads, which were particularly loved by the Ashanti in Ghana. And were traded in vast, vast quantities between Venice and Ghana over hundreds and hundreds of years. If you look at them, each one individually is a phenomenal sculpture and a phenomenal work of art, and each of them has very specific tie-ins to deities and religious belief. So we're talking about highly complex cultures. I'm out of time here, so I'll just flick through. I wanted to talk. I also have been thinking about how have these bead cultures survived. They've survived in Brazil intact in quite serious ways. But if you start picking under the surface, even in North American culture, you can see, for example, on this vinyl cover for Nas, if you look around his neck, he's not wearing any old beads there. He's actually wearing African Bodum beads. Again, a very, very sacred West African bead. This kind of bead, which were traded in large numbers. They're called the bead of kings in Africa. And only incredibly powerful males and matriarchs are allowed to wear these things. They're also supposed to have phenomenal magical powers. That's an original powder glass version, which looks very like the ones that Nas are wearing. So are we talking there about a rap star who actually has some kind of really quite sophisticated knowledge of West African bead cultures and how they relate to power. I don't know. Anyway, I don't want to go on too long because I've sort of run through my time, so I'll stop there. I'll just put that one. That's a girl from the East African, actually from Imham, who's clearly wearing some very early African beads in Brazil in 1840. So.
We have some time for questions, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. That was really wonderful. I was interested in what you said about the limitations of the archive, and as an art historian, I feel like we have a little more leeway. But it seems like in history, there needs to be some sort of manifestation. And I wondered how you felt about...
There needs to be some sort of...
Like manifestation, some sort of physical evidence or material evidence of whatever anybody says. And everything needs to be substantiated.
Yeah.
So I wonder how you feel about history's approach, and how you feel about reconciling art histories perhaps more.
I don't know, it's kind of, I mean, it's a really good question. How do you break down these disciplinary barriers? And, there's people who consider them, or who consider themselves to be real historians, who believe that the truth of the past can be recovered and can be stated in objective terms, are always going to be around. I think one of the big problems in ever erasing or questioning, or I suppose kind of creating more sympathetic, porous borders between disciplines, is that we've got to get away from the idea that, for example, anthropologists are people who are allowed to go out into the field and get dirty, but real historians are people who set up databases and actually deal with facts and figures and don't do that kind of thing. And as long as we have the distinction between anthropologists and real historians, I don't think things are going to change in a hurry. And I think people like the Prices, for example, Richard and Sally Price. Now I'd hold them out as prime examples of people who have managed and actually have made it a passionate, intellectual quest of theirs to actually question those barriers, and not only do that, but in their work, practically break them down. They're capable of doing really meticulous historical scholarship of the old school style, or even of being meticulous editors, like when they brought out, the journal of John Stedman. But there are also people who are, have really become intensely interested in the complexities around processes of creolization and what you can recover from, working with oral histories with people in the slave diaspora. And I don't think they now see any contradiction within it. But I think it takes a lot of courage. It's a bit like that stuff that Hilary was talking about earlier, about the pressure, and in fact several people in the panel were talking about earlier, the pressure there is on particularly younger academics to work in recognised fields and not to kick against the pricks and not to make a fuss. But I think it's a very, very important question, and I don't think there are any straightforward answers to it. I just hope we'll be in a position where things move on. I think anthropology is the most exciting field in many ways for breaking it down. I think that guy Michael Tausig is fantastic. Again, he doesn't work specifically that much in the area of slavery and diaspora, but I think the models he set out for us in his stuff on the Congo and the Rapa with the Putumayo Indians as well in the Amazon, that could be used as a whole set of paradigms for breaking down those barriers.
First, let me thank you. This was so wonderful and inspiring. For a moment, I want to ask you about maybe some more traditional artistic formats. Have we been able to find paintings or drawings by slaves? And if so, where some of these may be seen? And do we have anything that goes back to the 18th century? Or?
There are carvings. There's very little two-dimensional artwork that I know of. I mean, the kind of people who have a handle on all that, are those real meticulous historians like, Phil Morgan, who says there's an awful lot more stuff than people have kind of admitted or seen. I mean, obviously there's an increasing interest in trying to dig out material examples of slaves' aesthetic expression. Architecture, domestic objects have been the main areas. When it comes to these more rarefied forms, which either involve writing or two-dimensional art forms on paper, not that much stuff has survived. No. So again, that's where it starts to move into a white-generated and a white-policed archive.
Two comments. I guess a couple of comments.
It's not a.
Do you want to use this one?
I can talk loud. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I can. So one comment, sort of getting back to the first question, really has to do with the fact that as art historians, we think about representation. And my challenge to historians is that they're working with that too.
Yeah.
It's just often not acknowledged that in fact there are convention, selection, arrangement, all of these kinds of things that we do in our work that are actually part of what has to be conjured when one is writing history.
But visual rhetorics as hard to read as any other form of rhetoric, and yet historians aren't trained in how to read it. So, I mean, even when historians are given a budget to include large numbers of illustrations, they'll frequently include them and not analyse them. Or they're just seen as some kind of evidence that doesn't require discussion in the same way that a close, nuanced reading of a historic or a literary text would. I think you're quite right.
So I think there's that on one side, and then on the other, in some ways, the challenges that you are offering us with these provocative examples are partly the challenges that, in general, our ability to engage with new critical theoretical models with what one would term decorative arts, just generally, beyond kind of slave culture is really, I think, at a very larval stage. So I think in a way the challenges here are challenges that the field faces with a lot of objects beyond these. So maybe there's an opportunity here to imagine what kinds of oral traditions or other kinds of sources one could use to construct that kind of history.
I'm not going to defend historians, but in the spirit of contextualizing the evidence, I would very much like to hear your thoughts about those images of the slave stocks that you showed.
Sorry, Alexander, can you?
I was saying that I would like to hear his thoughts on the images of the slave stocks that he showed us.
What's precisely because we shouldn't just present the evidence, right? We need to.
You mean on what I've decided at this stage?
Well, I want to. I mean, there are different things that come to my mind when I see that image. And since we're talking about legacies, and I would very much like to hear your thoughts about that. You obviously did some selection of those images, and you selected that image.
Well, probably illegally, because I don't think you're allowed to photograph people's kids in the slave stocks and put them up. It's probably some massive invasion of their private rights. But I don't know. I have a big problem anyway, and I've spent a very long time thinking about if you were given an unlimited amount of money, an unlimited budget to build a museum of slavery, what should you put in it, and how would you make it? And I suppose those images are heavily invested for me in that central question of what do you actually get out of the exhibition of torture implements used to traumatize human bodies? Are they, a lot of good people have written about this, more perhaps maybe in the context of Holocaust studies, where there have been questions asked, why is it that the exhibition of human remains in tanks, in the glass cases in Majdanek or at some of the concentration camps, or of shoes with no one in them? Why do those have such tremendous power when maybe all you're doing is remembering the victims in terms of the fragments that have been left behind by the people who perpetrated the disaster? What do those things actually tell you about, or how do they take you close to historical memory? What's recoverable through looking at something like that. And if you start going into the area of what they call kind of like museum, an immersion theory, where people immerse themselves in the past so that they can recover, or to use that terrible phrase, the lived experience. How do you ever recover the lived experience of being in the slave stocks? So if you can't, what does that mean? I don't have a final solution to that question, but I think it raises a lot of very disturbing ethical questions. And if you don't allow children to start, or museum visitors to start trying these things on and playing with them, and you put them sealed off in a glass case, that raises a whole other series of questions with regard to what you're trying to do. So I don't think there are easy answers to these questions, but I find that stuff deeply problematic.
I think on that, very problematic and tortured note, we will move on. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Deborah Willis, who is known equally as an eminent photographer as well as an esteemed historian and curator of African American photography. She's the chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts at New York University, and also holds an affiliated appointment as university professor in Africana Studies at NYU. And these are only the latest of a series of important positions that she's held. For example, she's also been the curator of photographs and prints at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. She has also been a visiting artist at colleges and universities across the United States, including the Rhode Island School of Design. She was here in 1996 and 2008, I believe. Professor Willis has been the recipient of over 30 awards and fellowships, including a MacArthur Fellowship, a Guggenheim, and a W.E.B. Du Bois Fellowship at Harvard. In her many publications, she has quite literally written African Americans as subjects and makers of photographs into the history of American art and culture. It isn't surprising then that she was asked to contribute the chapter on photography in the landmark series, The Image of the Black in Western Art, which is published by Harvard University Press. Is it out yet, or is it forthcoming this year? Also out this year is Professor Willis's book, Envisioning Emancipation, Black Americans and the End of Slavery, which was timed to coincide with the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. This is a book that vastly expands the historical record by bringing together around 150 photographs, over half of which have not been seen by a modern public. It offers an account of both what slavery and freedom looked like and how photography produces the memories of that event from the mid-19th century forward. Time doesn't permit me to go into her wonderful photographic work, but I did want to mention one of the themes that she explores in her own photographs as well as those of others, namely the impact of photography on the production of an ideal of Black femininity. This subject is the focus of her most recent exhibition and exhibition catalog, Out of Fashion Photography, Embracing Beauty, for the Henry Art Gallery at the University of Washington in Seattle. Beauty and freedom are linked in ways that can be either oppressive or liberatory, and Professor Willis is perhaps our most important and influential artist intellectual exploring this complex terrain. Her remarks today are titled Visualizing Emancipation, Photography as Intervention. Please join me in welcoming Professor Willis.
Okay, wanted to say thank you for inviting me to join this conversation and to begin with the discussion. Can we start with the slides? Just to give a little background about this, invitation, it meant a lot to me to be a part of this discussion. And then this morning also explored ideas that I have been thinking about for a long time. How do we rethink this history based on our diverse disciplines? And just the idea of including photographs and objects and papers and oral histories, and this concept of how contemporary artists are also looking at this history about resistance. What I found important about this morning, also this session, what resonates through this talk will be about the imaginary and the camera, and the idea of remoteness, which I thought was a fantastic way of how to connect my research using photographs, and how images are a sense of living memory, and they serve this idea of how we can think of the idea of, and I love the concept, even though it's a hard one, of the corpse speaking, and through the idea of contemporary artists, and through the object of the image. So this talk is, I should time it, is going to be 20 minutes. And it really covers just kind of a history as I look at and think about how to use images and how to perceive this presence of the photograph, and how do we see the black body, and the body is constructed through the idea of enslavement and containment, but also through the idea of resistance, and through navigating these spaces of empowerment. And so I'm going to start with contemporary artists who are looking at objects from the past. And this is work by Hank Willis Thomas, who is looking at the idea of art, and through some years ago, Absolute Vodka hired artists to create art for African Americans, and to sell ideas, basically to sell Absolute Vodka. But Hank Willis Thomas is also looking at old images and consider the idea of the slave ship, this object here, the Brooks slave ship, to the power in terms of the absolute power. And then when we spoke this morning, when I heard this morning the idea of power, the whole aspect of power and power period. So he actually puts this slave ship and can imagine the ideas of people empowering, that the power that people have in terms of putting together cultures from all over the continent of Africa into one slave ship, and the idea of how absolute power, period. And what do you say to that? You know, and as we look at that history. So as an artist, he's looking at that idea of how bodies are put together, and using the period at the end, just silence this idea of power, as we mentioned this morning. And so also Carrie Mae Weems is a contemporary artist, also looking at the ideas. She says, I looked and looked and I cried. And she's looking at the historical images that were created by J.T. Zealy for Agassiz, for Louis Agassiz, when he was hired. He hired through another party to have blacks enslaved on the plantations in South Carolina to be photographed. And so Carrie Mae Weems is also thinking and looking back at that memory, and says, you became a scientific profile, an anthropological debate, a Negro type, and a photographic subject. She covers the hue of red as if the blood is still through the veins and the bodies of these people. And so the idea of memories is still there, it's not remote, and that's what she is working through. Deborah Priestley also is looking at objects and looking at the history of memory through shackles, through the containment of jars, as many of us grew up with families who preserved jellies and fruits and contained in a jar. And so Deborah is actually using photographs and using text to create this history, and using photographs to tell that story. But just to start off with some of these images, and we think about how the power of images have basically transformed the idea of how to read black bodies. This is the original photograph that Carrie used from that history of I cried is Jack, and then from Guinea, and the handwritten notes from the photographer, or possibly from the Giz, from Taylor, the Esquire, from the Columbia, South Carolina, the plantation. So we see how this body is performed and performing for this history and representing history. He photographed, well, we're unsure of the number of people he photographed, but we know that there were 15 surviving daguerreotypes that are at Harvard. But the idea that these bodies, these people walked into the studio and were stripped. Some were in fully nude clothing, and then there are girls and women who were exposed in terms of the dress, and in terms of dehumanizing their bodies and placing them as objects. Hank Willis Thomas was also looking at the idea of power within corporate America. The idea of using the credit card, how we are in contemporary culture enslaved by the use of MasterCard, and he's using the idea of the MasterCard, that we're still connected to that, but we're also brutalized by this history, and using a photograph of Gordon, who is also known as the Scourged Back. But Celeste Marie Bernier, who's a art historian in London, also found this kind of tambourine, as a child's tambourine, that she researched a project, and this piece was found sometime during World War II, when they were trying to kind of during recreation time, when young girls and children needed play, and the family looked for papers in the attic to make a tambourine. What they found was this ledger, this piece from a slave ship, a document where females, the number of Negro women and men, the names of the families who owned enslaved these black bodies. And so these, in the attics of some of the families that lived in London, and in many of the houses, as mentioned earlier, that we can find objects and then to recreate ways of reusing and recycling papers, how this object was just, oh, this makes great sound, this paper is nice paper, but then the history of this object is used. Also, when we think of handwriting and the narrative of slavery, thinking of the work, and this portrait here is a $50 reward for a runaway slave by the name of Dolly. This is part of a collection in the Louis Manicold papers, and underscored is $50 reward. There's a photograph of Dolly. This is the first time I've actually worked on a project that you could actually see a photograph on a runaway slave ad, but ran away from the yard corner of Jackson and 7th Broad Street in Augusta, Georgia on 7 April 1863, woman Dolly. And it says here that that she is 30 years of age, light complexion, hesitates somewhat when spoken to, and basically is rather good looking and not very healthy, but rather good looking, and has never changed her owner. And so there's a dialogue as if she has betrayed him because she ran away, was enticed off by some white man. And so we see this dialogue of how runaway slave ad, after emancipation, after the signing of the proclamation, the $50 reward, and this circulated in the Augusta police station and other areas, but begin to see the story of Dolly in framing this idea of self-emancipation. And these images tell a different story. We also see how bodies and black bodies were seen as objects placed within this street scene of Atlanta, Georgia, where black body auction and Negro sales next to china and silverware and glassware. And we begin to see how these bodies circulated through the cities and viewed. Here's a actual auction block in St. Louis, and here is the original image. Here is a stereograph. But we see this also considering this idea of tourism and how tourism is central with the photograph, and these images were repeated and circulated in different cities. But one image that I worked with Barbara Krauthammer and we decided to collaborate on a book, as mentioned earlier, on envisioning emancipation. And we found this fascinating photograph at the Smithsonian in terms of how do we think about remembering history and remembering the idea of women. And it's this photograph of a washerwoman. And she is photographed with an American flag pinned to her chest. We see her direct gaze, we see her looking into the camera, but she's telling a story about empowerment based on her pose and her gaze. But the fact that she's thinking about the ideal of patriotism within that notion of wearing the American flag pinned to her chest. Rarely do we find images of these circulating in encased images, but then we see the images of abolitionists that we see often, and this is a photograph of Frederick Douglass. And here we see the idea of engagement. We see the idea of Frederick Douglass posed with this sense of purpose and the idea of thinking about how and what it meant to be photographed and used to see as object. But he is also, and considering style and dress, he is becoming seen as not as human property, but seen as man, and also seen as dandy, as we see the aspect of abolitionism. We also imagine these black bodies as they lectured and throughout the country and throughout different areas in the North, where we see this image here of Frederick Douglass with the Edmondson sisters, Mary and Emily, standing near Gerrit Smith and others at the Fugitive Slave Law Convention. And one of the aspects that Frederick Douglass says that, and we see the crowd, this is this is a daguerreotype. Rarely do you see outdoor daguerreotypes, but we see this scene here and it's packed. And he says that the public had been itching to hear and to see a colored man speak. And they wanted to see them speak and perform. And so perform the idea of slavery, tell the story. So we see the two Edmondson sisters who were women who were part of this movement who ran away, and they were about to be shipped off to New Orleans. And the idea of their history it's a broad history, and I'm not going to go through the whole story, but here they are standing, telling the story, about to tell their story and their experience of the ship moving, going back, their parents buying them, and through the abolitionist movement, saving money so that they could actually go back into the communities and speak about the experience of slavery, but also work with others where they began to perform the idea of the auction block, so that they also had this aspect of how photography is seen as performance. And they were beautiful women, beautiful young girls, and we see how their bodies have been presented in photographs, but they're also significant in telling the story about emancipation and the idea of being characterized as enslaved. But because of their beauty, they were concerned, their families were concerned that they would be sold into prostitution as fancy girls in the South. Also, images that when we think about imagining and envisioning emancipation, we see images such as this one of Urias Africanus McGill, who was a merchant, and he was a freedman from Baltimore, lived in Liberia, photographed by a black photographer, Augustus Washington. And his family, his father migrated to Liberia in 1827. But McGill and his sister also, they had a company where they were merchants. They sold wares such as soap and on the west coast of Africa, and they continued to work throughout the early mid-1800s into the 19th century. Photographs that circulated also were these rare images of young girls working on plantations, and also used to hold young children, families to be photographed. But then images such as Sojourner Truth, as when we think about how abolitionists use the image to tell the story, where she says here, I sell the shadow to support the substance. So she is a lecturer. She's also seeing herself telling expressing the experience of slavery, the horror of slavery, but the idea of dress was really significant for her story. Images such as this is a photograph by J.P. Ball. I thought it was really important to show images of Black photographers and show the activity of Black photographers who were also abolitionists, that their stories were important, that they understood the importance of telling the idea of the runaway slave. And this image here is an unidentified and unknown woman, but she was born in Kentucky. She's self-emancipated. She had 2 Union soldiers guide her through Cincinnati, later to Wisconsin, but they stopped in the photographic studio to pose. And as they have the pistol to their breast, as if this sense of bravery. So we begin to see how the notion of how this experience is significant. Harriet Tubman, also with the Underground Railroad, nurse, spy, and scout. And then images of evidence of her ability to travel and to take people with her. And then looking at the abolitionist movement, the idea of how images circulated. This is a daguerreotype abolitionist pin with the black hand and a white hand together, holding a Bible, in terms of a sense of oath and belief that the pin was pinned, often worn on the breast of a man's suit. And then the jigsaw puzzle. This is this is called The Emancipation of Slaves, 1860s. And this is a sense of education, of how, and during leisure moments where families are talking about and teaching about slavery, that this image is used as they put together a puzzle of 132 jigsaw pieces, and to create the story of Columbia, this whole aspect of freedom, telling the narrative of the Middle Passage and the brutality of slavery, and then at the end with the emancipation. Other images that the abolitionists used also was the branded hand. And this image here is of a hand by the name of Jonathan Walker. He was known as a slave stealer. He had, in 1844, he actually tried to take some of the people from his church to Bahamas, and he was caught and he was branded. And this is a photograph that circulated with the SS on his hand, and then monuments were created for him, but also the images were sold as he lectured about the experience. And he felt that he would not scream out, cry, because he knew, such as this type of image, this is what most Blacks had to experience at the time of branding, and then also the horrific whippings. So images by abolitionist photographers, but also of emancipated slaves from Louisiana, circulated to help educate, tell the story of slavery, to tell the brutality of it, to have people understand. And these images circulated in many ways because they're around in a number of collections today. But here we see the idea of what it meant to be branded. We see Wilson Chin, but we also see the torture of slavery. And then images of education, the importance of education, where the 3 children who are enslaved also were formerly enslaved, with white-skinned, light-skinned children, with Wilson Chin, also circulating this idea of how learning is wealth and the importance of education during this time. So these are images that circulated as we found them, as they are now, and I'm going to go through a couple of these images through the Civil War with Nick Biddle. The idea of how photography was used by the Civil War soldiers. There were poses that included dignified poses of masculinity and hypermasculinity, but images such as Nick Biddle, and this is a school for the Civil War soldiers, and we see the outside in Philadelphia. We see the soldiers standing outside waiting to attend classes. And so this is the military school for Camp William Penn. But also that Frederick Douglass's sons, they went into the photographic studio, they joined the 54th, and we see this idea of masculinity through their posing with their armature, with, this is a photograph just in terms of the idea of journalism, and then the aspect of how this is Thomas Morris Chester. He's the first African-American journalist and correspondent to document and report the war, specifically in Virginia. And these are other images that circulated in terms of posing. Martin Delaney, unidentified portraits, but the idea of backdrops, how soldiers walked into the photographic studio, looked for ideal pose and idealized pose, basically to prove that they were a part of their own emancipation, that they were a part of the idea of creating their sense of manhood based on the American flag, their patriotism, and their citizenship. A wedding portrait in Maryland of a Civil War soldier with his wife, and her name is Fanny Sturgis, and he's wearing his uniform. Family is the reason why the Civil War was important for black soldiers to fight. It's because of their families. So photographs were used to explore ideas of before and after entering the camp, and then posing with the uniform. And then Charlotte Fortin, a woman from Philadelphia who moved south to teach some of the freed schools. And then Henry Moore also photographed, recreating a scene of a plantation, but creating this idyllic scene of plantation, of sweet potato planting. We see how baskets were used when we think about families and working together. We see men who are wearing the discarded uniforms of the Union soldiers, but we see the hose, and we see this style of dress. We see this aspect of beauty, but also the aspect of what happens when the plantations were freed or left alone by the owners. And then freedmen who moved north who moved to the Virginia lines, and their families with what they had. And these were photographs that circulated also as gifts and tourism. But here we see in the Rappahannock River, we see families with all they had on their backs. They're on horses, they're in wagons, and they're traveling, and they're moving into Union camps. Susie King Taylor, who was a nurse and teacher, and also read to many of the soldiers, teaching them how to read and write. And images of men working. So many of the blacks who were formulated as Union soldiers also worked as laborers and cooks and buried many of the dead Union and Confederate soldiers. So we see this aspect of this. We also see the torture, the aspect of what happens in war. You know, this is a man who lost his leg and arm and posing, and he was photographed by one of the surgeons who photographed a number of and creating what happens with surgery and health care for soldiers during the time of the Civil War. The photographs were significant in helping to prepare for the future and how to take care of some of these soldiers. And one of the aspects that I loved is how posing was significant in reading these images of the pose. Here one soldier is still part of the frame, where he's waiting also to enter into the frame and send and pose with a weapon. And images also that circulated were the Confederate soldiers who stayed with men from the Confederacy, the slave master, and the relationships that they forged and maintained. The idea of religion and documenting photographs in churches during slavery, and then through emancipation. The reason for this aspect of emancipation was the idea to have a property, to own stores, to educate families. And we see a man who owns the store in 1888. This is an Emancipation Day celebration in Richmond, Virginia. We see the crowd standing in front, but we also see a young boy waving a flag, and this whole aspect of Abraham Lincoln and patriotism within the frame. The Lincoln Monument, and then also monuments that were developed. This is a monument for Frederick Douglass in Rochester, New York. We see this crowd scene at the day of the unveiling of the monument. So we see the importance of his voice in terms of style and power and resistance, the politics that the access that Frederick Douglass had to his voice to many of the people who attended this rally. And then I'm ending here with the idea of the photographic album and how significant the album has been for many in terms of the idea of the photographic album considers a sense of power and mystical power, and is collected in many ways. We see this in this Moroccan leather bound book, but it also looks as if it's the same people who designed Bibles and created and published Bibles. So we see this as a religious experience when we look at a photographic album. We see the sense of group identity. We see how the clasps are used, but we see the gold leaf, and we see also the importance of how memory is preserved. This is Marguerite, a freed woman. And just imagine going into this is a tintype, a large 8x10 tintype, an unusual size for a tintype. And here we see Marguerite, it says formerly enslaved, a free woman. How she identifies herself as a free woman, we can see by the pose and by her gaze. We also see this image here of a woman at the gate. Her style and her sense of freedom with the one hoop earring, the hat, and creating an idea of femininity through personhood, through also the ideas of men posing in the photographic studio. Ending with this image here with towns and the idea of Pap Singleton creating the town in Kansas, where he had a group of people moving west to Kansas, creating this town for blacks. And then idea of Aunt Memory, who was a woman who attended the 1893 World's Fair, created a sense of oral history and telling the story about slavery. Emancipation Day celebrations, emancipation in terms of slavery reunions, where slaves would, in 1918 in Washington, D.C., these are people who were over 100 years old. And then finally, monuments that were created. This is for the Edmondson sisters. And here we see, this is in Alexandria, Virginia. This is where the boat where they were docked, where the boat was caught, and this is kind of a sense of placement and sense of memory of history, using the Edmondson sisters to recreate that history. This monument here in Washington, D.C., of the Civil War soldiers, and we see this monument in terms of community coming together to recreate the memory and to preserve the memory. This is a kind of the notion of the placement and seeing this experience. And then finally with Meta Warwick Fuller, this is an emancipation statue in Boston. And so when I think about this idea for this conference in photography and art as an intervention, it's a way to have access to the imaginary and to consider how art is seen as a voice for contemporary audiences to consider the past. Thank you.
Again, you give us so much to sort of think about and absorb, and I guess one of my questions really is, it's an old question of the face, but it's a question of access. The public monument has a certain kind of built-in access to people geographically aligned, but how does one kind of promote access to these images for people that might not be able to afford to buy an expensive book, or that might not walk into a gallery? So is that something?
Access is the internet, I think, is just fascinating. I traveled, Barbara traveled to find images. We didn't even know that they existed, but the we knew the story that we both wanted to tell. I found images in the 70s that were in the Library of Congress, and finally having a way to use them. So the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, the Harry Ransom Center down in Texas. So there are a number of places that we can actually go online and research through the internet, and the access is there. The fascinating experience for me is to watch young artists to use and understand ways of retelling a history to another generation. Some people, when I teach a class, that they're trying to find ways to understand the history through dress, through text, through the idea of beauty, to see that Manicault said that she's rather good looking with a fine set of teeth. What does that mean to a 21st century audience? We rarely have read where masters would actually publicly announce the beauty of a black woman. And here he is circulating, Manicault is circulating this in a public way. So Dolly meant something to him personally as a property, but also personally as a woman. And so these images, and I think I found that image, it was maybe about 12 years ago, and didn't know how to use it for a long time, and wanted to kind of explore this idea of how beauty is posed within African American culture. Yes.
I'm interested in the research that you did as you watched this transition from enslavement to from enslavement to Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, self-representation. What you found was interesting and startling and surprising as you look at these images and how people saw themselves.
Cornell Library has a great 19th century collection, and to find a puzzle, to me, to find the idea of that someone had time to create a puzzle, a leisure time puzzle, for people to talk about the difficulties of slavery, but also to work with an artist to present images in that sense. The idea of Marguerite, a free woman, to see as a photographer, you rarely see 8 by 10 tintypes. They're mainly smaller, especially of black subjects, and to see it hand colored as well. And that was new for me. But the idea of, we see, this idea of the hand on the hip, so that's a sense of empowerment, and reading that image. They were important for me, and to find the connection with abolitionists, the idea of the abolitionist lectures, and abolitionists creating performance, like, theater, to recreate slavery for a northern audience to understand what it meant to be on the slave block. So just in terms of what Marcus talked about with Colonial Williamsburg, that aspect of performing history is something that I didn't even realize that they were doing in the 1850s. And when I found that just it was a conundrum, but it also was a fascinating and beautiful way of telling a story for me. So there was that, and how to, there were images that I found that I wanted to include, such as, just in terms of looking for the stories of letters of Civil War soldiers to incorporate the stories where the soldiers and their mothers, the mothers' letters to President Lincoln. Make sure my son, I did my part, I'm sending my son, now I want you to make sure he's paid fully. I mean, the mothers were belligerent, and beautiful in terms of that. So there were the voices that I never heard in studying the history, and it's there. And that's, when you think about access, it's there. If we just have to, find them, Yeah. Thank you.
panelist today is Professor Barbara Martinez-Ruiz, who is an art historian on the faculty at Stanford University. He was born in Cuba and studied the history of art there, graduating from Havana University, and was professor of Caribbean art at the, and pardon me for murdering Spanish, the Instituto Superior de Arte in Havana, and later at Havana University. And then was it 5 years later or so that he came to the United States, where he earned a PhD in art history at Yale University. The focus of his scholarship was graphic writing systems in Central Africa and Cuba, and he spent 2 years teaching this subject at the Rhode Island School of Design as he was completing his PhD. So I think, Marcus, you need to go to RISD so you can complete the RISD connection on the panel here. This work has just been published this year as a monograph by Temple University Press titled Congo Graphic Writing and Other Narratives of the Sign. It is already getting rave reviews and being hailed as groundbreaking in taking up the importance of Congo visual and written systems on the African diaspora. Professor Martinez-Ruiz has lectured widely on African art and Afro-Caribbean religion and has curated exhibitions on contemporary and African art. He's also displayed his own multimedia work in solo and group exhibitions. Finally, Professor Martinez-Ruiz was the co-organizer of a major exhibition on art and slavery in 2007 at the Yale Center for British Art, and co-editor of an award-winning volume of essays that accompanied the exhibition. The exhibition and book were both titled Art and Emancipation in Jamaica, Isaac Belisario and His Worlds, and this I kind of lay out there for the graduate students among you as something to aspire to. In the preface of the book, the director of the British Arts Center, Amy Myers, noted that it was our speaker's memorable, her words, graduate seminar paper on the Jamaican artist Isaac Belisario that was the spark fueling this important exhibition and its companion book. So not a bad outcome for a seminar paper. Anyway, so I must say, so today he's speaking on the subject of African spirituality in modern art. Please join me in welcoming Barbara.
Good afternoon, Ms. Kate. Thank you for having me today. I would like to say thank you to Tony for still believing in me. I think it's a very, very important gesture to having me today. For me, this lecture presentation is quite problematic because I like specific. I like to talk about concrete things. And then in the field of African art, sometimes we don't talk about specific. And throughout today's presentation, many different terms and concepts came across, like freedom, justice, retribution, heritage, or maybe it could be in opposition to something like modernity, capitalism, or colonialism. What have to do all of these terms with aesthetics, visual, culture, and art in relation to African people and African descendants? That for me would be the most important question. How we start thinking about those important concepts and apply to something more concrete, something more specific when we're talking about people and how people produce something we call art. And which moment in our history we start calling what used to be material culture, we start calling this art. That I think is the kind of problems we encounter in African art. It's a very small field that is still struggling with all these different concepts. And for me, one of the problems is the idea of African art in general is based in the deficit model. Like the idea of African people came to Americas with empty-handed and empty-headed. Like there's nothing, no way we can even reorganize, reconstruct this possible cultural model. But I was attending to a lecture at Tate, Britain in 2007, 2009, from the main curator, Nicolas Bourdieu, who decided to deal with issues of representation, how we talk about the other never being part of the history. And he came across with this interesting, funky term, art modern. He tried to oppose it, to create a new way, a new word that had to be inserted in the new vocabulary of our history. But I started thinking about art modern, and the idea from the project to be more inclusive, to add artists from the periphery, artists from African diaspora into the new globalization of artistic practice. But I think the exhibition failed because few artists from the periphery being included into this exhibition, and the ones being included didn't talk about those issues at all. I mean, the idea of alter modernity as an alternative to modernity, the main established discourse about modernity in relation to the others who are in the periphery, pretty much fell through. But the idea of modernity had to do more with, you study the etymology of the word, had to do with spade or castrate. It means a modernity that had to be cut from the bottom all the way to cutting all the roots and reassembled together. Sounds to me very, evoke pretty much this idea of Habermas of an incomplete modernity. That in somehow we have the duty, responsibility in the 21st century to complete that modernity. But what had to do this with modern art or African people working in this crossroad, in this intersection? But there are important problems that in somehow force us to talk about issues that had to do with the periphery, like how we deal with primary sources and how we treat those primary sources, like early print, travel narrative, like being present today in the two lectures before me. The colonial narrative, how the power of this colonial narrative, misunderstanding of cultural differences, how we acknowledge cultural differences. It's difficult when you're a slave, that doesn't have any kind of way to be visible. History and imperialism, how slavery is interconnected to, and how visible, what is the power of that history in relation to that main history. Political systems, when you have economic system that is somehow puts you upside or in the edge of that, economic transaction. The absence of a local agency, we don't believe African people have, came with history, with culture. And an universal law, that in this case art, modern art, function at that level. We think modern art is the final destination for all artistic practice in the world. We think African people, African descendant, eventually, by default, will embrace modernity and finish with this idea of the universal law in relation to art. That, I think, is the kind of assumption, as art historian, we in general make. But the other problem it had to do with theory versus methodology. When you're an art historian working with a specific set of tools, there is a contradiction that emerges from that, positioning yourself in relation to this. Or the power of history versus oral history, how we recognize the power of oral history at the same level of the history, the canonical one that had to do with books. Modernity versus modernization, that is something we had to deal with Africa. Civilized versus traditional, culture versus nature, culture versus the individual, or high culture versus low culture. And in general, African tradition being associated through popular tradition, that mean in our history have a particular set of terms that doesn't have to go into the realm of high art. That pretty much is what's really happening. This contradiction between art and culture is still a problem for our historian, like someone who's working with African art history. How we call historical African visual forms, how we call that traditional, or we call those art, that is still attention, or we call art versus material culture, cultural evidence, that is still pretty much the kind of tension we're still facing right now. Art history principle, I just highlight the ones that still dominating the discipline up to the present day: authenticity, provenance, quality, ideology, and theory. And the fascination to always find a sense of authorship that's still somehow regulating the way we understand discipline. And the positions the African art had to do with these debates about what is culture in relation to art. The African art went through, I think in the last few centuries, serious problems, specific like the killing the African tradition and the death of his historical art, what we call traditional. And start from this notion of fetish from the 14th century all the way to the 19th century. And the idea of fetish you can see in the slide from the left, far left from 16th century, Pigafetta, and show scenes of burnings, what he called idols of fetish. But you have, like, a century later, again another scene from Araldi manuscript from Pigafetta, showing the same scenes killing a religious space. And you have a 19th century, late 19th century photograph, and you can see burnings, religious object. You have a systemic killing and destruction of African tradition in history and being documented in primary sources. But the second one is the relationship between this type of culture or art with the idea of superstitious witchcraft, black magic. And it's just showing, this is a cartoon from 1920s in Belgium, talking about issues of religion in domestic life in the Belgian Congo. So pretty much you go from systematic representation of destruction of local culture through centuries. And the 20th century you have this cartoon using caricature to even to talk about this idea of neutralizing the power of those images. But you have also other type of images. This is from Carolus Eller, who was the same author who did the illustration at the beginning of the show, the slide. And this is presenting African people as savage cannibals, dismantling a human body. You have a systematic representation, this kind of pseudo-human aspect of African people. Going to what I call Hollywood fantasy. In 1920s, 1930s, when Hollywood started, representing African people in a very specific manner. This is a zombie that doesn't have to do anything with someone to control the mind of someone else. Zombie comes from Zambi, is the term from God in Congo traditions. You have an interesting mistranslation, even the term from Kikongo into Creole language in Haiti, translated to Hollywood fantasy as something negative, like a build up into these layers of negativity put in relation to African culture. But representing during the time of slavery, and then you have from all the time of negotiations with the others in America, and this is Albert Eckhout, a Congo woman with child. It's very important, the caption, because recognizing the location of that, the region of that person. She's a woman, and also she's from the Congo. It's not clear from that image what is the status of this person. She is free, or she is a slave. But I was talking today with Marcus about how we deal with those images. And we start reading the images that have a very clear ideological connotation, how far you can take those images in order to read cultural value that re-evaluate the way African culture being presented through this type of images. This is what I wanted to do, this is what I like to do through this kind of image. Going through this negative reading of ideological charge of images, this is one way to look at this image, but there had to be another way we can challenge those images. And for example, the cloth tied to the hips, to the right side, this is a very typical Congo tradition. Only a mature woman who is married and have a child can have, and you can find in Scotland. This is the only other place you will find it. And also, the color is very important. Red means she's over 25, or she's been initiated in womanhood. And the fabric is a specific fabric from the Congo. That is, talk about the trading at the time of textile from Holland into Brazil. But I can talk more. But you have other example in the front pair from 1795 representing African people as pseudo-humans or animal. You have in the visual imaginary of European reading African people as not human. And in the realms of human behavior that is beyond to what we call civilized man. Or you have this another example from Brazil when you represent this domestic slave that is part of a very specific economic transaction and a human relationship they are servant of. Or when you deal with images like this one, this is from Isaac Mende Belisario, when Isaac Mende Belisario did this set of prints, system prints at the time of emancipation. Was for me is an incredible documentation of public life when slaves in Jamaica have the right to celebrate emancipation. And this is pretty much like an accidental ethnography. But when we see those images, when you get into Jamaica, into the airport, this is the image that welcome you. And they are pretty much set, they have the ears in a very specific way. That is somehow they are attached to the idea of tourism and celebrating this new exotic place in which African people have a say and somehow promote more tourism, I think, in the mind of people who work in the tourist office in Jamaica. But really what is being hide behind those images is the relationship between African people in that particular moment of emancipation and what really that image represents. I just want to show you, this is like you have 4 different type of cultural tradition that's been fit into this particular object. And you have these houses, boat houses, built out of papier mâché. They had to be destroyed after they're being used. And you have very specific iconography that they are connected to specific African traditions in plural in Jamaica, not a single one. I think it's the idea of one single African tradition is something that is still damaging the way we think about the legacy of African people after emancipation and slavery. I think it's something I wanted to. Here, this image represents 3 of the most important African trends in Jamaica, in the making of Jamaican identity. They are just in one single shot. Just give it an example of the flavor, that what you can read with those images. And people with history. When we talk about people, I think Diane was talking about issues of representations, and when we think about, as an art historian, we're still thinking about issues of representation, but the first question would be who has the right to represent and who represent the others? Or the second question would be self-representation, how African people represent themselves and how we can interrogate also this other type of representation. But this is an incredible document. You look at the year, 1599, it's very early. The African people representing themselves as merchants, as people that have economic agency in this new colonial setting. This is in South America, but it gives you a set of free Muslim men, traders in the diaspora, using portrait tradition to signify themselves in this new economic tide. But also go back to this idea of bling bling you will find in hip hop in the 21st century. It's not new, it's already been for more than 500 years. But anyway, it's just a detail. Or you have another example of African people represent in the European context, European city. You talk about this idea of a relationship between Africa and European cities, European countries. Or when you see this type of image representing African people performing something, and how you interrogate those images that allow you to understand what is performing, what that means, this idea of representation of the body, what it's trying to represent with all the different poses and gesture being documented by this particular example. Or this, again, the pair that show a prince who is walking by the river. They have just a detail on the right that show the Nkaka Adekwa, this is the name of this headdress made out of feathers and represent this landing of power from the sky into the head of the person, and used for self-confidence and determination. But you can see this is from the 70s, 1668, 19th century. This is from Fuchsia Laws. This is a doctor, German doctor. I found this illustration in the medical school at Yale, looking for materials. A doctor who was sent in the 19th century to do field work, to study tropical disease. And he did a series of illustrations that show an Nganga, is the man on the left, standing in front of an Nkisi, a religious object. And you can see a postcard from the 19th century being used to send it to a family member in Lisbon and Paris and Brussels that represent a religious authority. And the last one, this is a member of early 20th century of Cabildo, is fraternity in Cuba, that using the same headdress on the top. Pretty much you can see the connection between the use of particular elements, and it somehow allow you to understand this is a very specific trademark had to do with Central Africa. It's not just Central Africa, Congo tradition from northern Angola and southern Congo. Or you see this is for you, the bread. When you see this image, it's very interesting. You see, and even the caption is very important. Negro fetichero is a black witch doctor. It's a very pejorative term. But what is he doing here? Why? He's dressed up in this elegant clothing, but he's enclosing himself in a circle. This is a very unique cultural trademark you cannot dismiss. In order to, he's also signified by the caption, he's a priest. He's someone with religious knowledge. We don't know exactly which one. In order to identify, it had to be a Central African one, a Congo one, is because he's enclosing himself in a circle. You know, giving this innocent depiction from the bread, to give you an incredible amount of information about the way in which people, African people, being represented through, through the others, but it somehow allow us to open like a tiny window to understand the way also they present themselves through the other. Or you see this Nkisi, Sugu, Mbuki. I use the term because what we call in African art, we call Nkisi Kondi. It's like a John Smith, or we call power figure. I used to be fetish before. We went from fetish to power figure. They have a very wacky, new agey connotation. And now we call Nkisi and Kondi. It doesn't mean anything. But Zugu and Mbuki give you the precise function of this object. But it's on the left, you see this one documented by Robert Farris Thompson in the 70s in the Congo. In the right, this is Bumba. This is the same type of Nkisi used for Jewish, members of the Jewish community in Cuba who embrace Congo religions. And they had to be tied to the ceiling of the house and had to be on full. When the Bumba touched the ground is when it's really charged. Bring his power, spread the power into the space. And going through something like charms hanging on the ceiling pipe. This is from Brooklyn, New York. It's 1994. Pretty much the same tradition. You can find also the Bumba in Union City in New Jersey. If you want to, I can take you to the field work and you can find it. Anyway, but what I mean in terms like creolization, hybridity, syncretism, and transculturations. I've been accused last week by someone in Belgium. I was a purist because I wanted to read, I wanted to understand the specific. I cannot, because the way we had to talk about African traditions through art, we had to use these 4 different terms. And the problem for me, the term of the syncretism was the first one that being used in the early, 1929 was used in kind of public domain by Malinowski, but was introduced by a Cuban ethnographer, Fernando Ortiz. Implied the idea of a two-part had to come together to become something else. But at that moment of becoming something else, you start losing who you are. Your essence had to be dissolved to become the third part. It's a highly problematic concept. Even we think it's the way we define popular culture, African interaction with other culture, multiculturalism. For me, it presents an interesting challenge because when we are syncretize, hybridize, creolize, how you can talk about these African traits in that new entity, what kind of instrument we need to use to unfold that, to understand. But we have the idea under the umbrella of syncretism, creolization, these saints that represent African people in European context. And I'm going from 17th century, all images of fraternity. It had to be fraternity of black men and women in Europe. Or you have this Nkisi figure documented by Lydia Cabrera in the 19th century, that it's being used in the 19th century, 1975. This is before emancipation in Cuba. That is the only example of Nkisi we have in Cuba so far being documented. Or you have this on the right, the dolls, that is pretty much the way Congo people understand the use of the previous Nkisi and Kondi in the form of doll. Just to give it a flavor, I have too many images, but the other one is those expoto. You can find it, this is from Brazil, when you have this represented one of the deity from Umbanda, Zepelintra, is the deity of the crossroad, the destiny. This is before Zepelintra became an archetype in Umbanda tradition. It's a black person, and the coins also they had to do with the similar way we read those nails in the Nkisi Kondi. We'll get to that. And the other type of Nkisi or Mpungu is Ntutu, or Mpungu, Ntutu, and Longo. This is a proper name because Ntutu uses a bottle. Use the terminology is very important. And this is another one from Tervuren. They have like 10,000 of these bottles being documented in Tervuren. And there are type of object that enclose medicine inside, and they're used for religious practice. The question is why Tervuren wanted to collect 10,000 of these type of objects. And on the left and the right, what you see from early 20th century, the documentation of the type of Nkisi, and you see on the right, the present day, the way in which this tradition is still in use in Central Africa, specifically in Congo and Angola. And this is an example, historical example from the US, when you have a figure, someone holding a bucket for containing water. In this case, you have to talk about this relationship between Christianity and African belief, the idea of replacing traditional historical medicine from Africa with water. And the bucket signified the power of Simbi, is the spirit of the water in the Congo tradition. Or you have this Simbi Makaya, this Pluto is a Simbi Makaya. There are those bottles from Voodoo in Haiti. I can't even give you the detail of reading of the clothing and the position and the color, but just I want you to illustrate today. But when we talk about this idea of creolization, I have a great opportunity. This crucifix used to belong to Walter Rice, who donated his entire collection to Yale University Art Gallery, one of the main collections in American history. And Charlie Menison, I have a summer internship to catalog his work. And this is one of the objects I encountered in working in his house. And I asked him if I can remove one of the tack from the cross. So what about it? Just wanted to send it to the lab and analyze. I sent it to the lab, and the report came back to me with a combination of 21 organic ingredient being placed in the hole and sealed by that. My question is, why you have almighty, most powerful object of Christianity is the optimal power had to be reinforced. What a kind of mindset believe even God is incomplete, is not even on the power. There had to be only this mindset. But this is the crucifix made in Rwanda by Bakongo people who used to be prisoner of Portuguese. They used to then live in the Ilha de Rwanda, who create this series of crucifixes in the 16th century, early 16th century, to be Bakongo. He used to inhabit the Congo Bank. Used to be now is an island full of restaurants and so forth. And the group who live in that community, they used to be Bakongo from the north. And this is the way it being translated to diaspora with the Paquet Congo in the form of using the crucifix. But when you go to representing an ancestor as someone a great deal to you, someone who passed away, and how that person empowered your life, and you go from the left all the way to the middle, when you have a container that holds this 21 spirit inside, and you have on the right, this is from Voodoo, but popular imagination also came across as an important way to empower those, to extend the power of those images. And going back to the crucifix, you can read in relation to Christianity, it's very clear the way in which that crucifix is being put together as an object. But the idea of certain geometric shapes are very important, because a triangle facing down, meeting in the middle, that means commitment and completion in Congo tradition. This is why you have in the feet of, also in the dress of Jesus Christ. It's not really a normal cloth, it's a cloth that's divided in a square, and the square have 4 different triangles facing in the middle, like a cosmogram. You have also representation of winds. It's very important that European iconography is really replaced by these symbols of air, very important in Congographic writings. Pretty much you have a correlation between African tradition and Western iconography coming together, speaking not just in replacing the other, in the way we understand syncretism and hybrid synchronization. They are pretty independent routes. They operate in their own right in each of these individual cultural traditions, is what I try to say. What you have on the left is in Kisi Kondi that have used the nails. Nails in Kikongo is a term for nails in Kikongo is zonzo. It's like profound thing, idea, and also deep feeling. And it's the nails operate here to seal the medicine that represent the deal you made with the client. And solving the client problem has to do with the way in which that nails live in relation to, attached to the object when it fell, pretty much mean that problem is no longer a problem, doesn't exist. And also nails, zonzo means a notebook. It's like a recording device, like recording history. Each of the nails are very different. They are sharp, circular, small, they're different material, and each of them has a particular name and telling you the function and the situation of the client that went to that. It's pretty much you can read that object like a book if you want. On the right, pretty much you have a replacement of nails, zonzo, by the tag. And when you have a medicine, the idea of a medicine empowering the object, similar to the Kisi Kondi. Well, if you look for similarity, you never find them. You need to understand it the way this conceptual structure that is underneath of that object. Because you never find that similarity in the object, because everything changed. You need to understand the mindset that allows that object to function in a particular cultural context. And just give you the sense of how you go from this accumulation of nails on the left, from the Kisi Kondi, from the crucifix, from the saints, like you have anthropomorphism, and from the called memory yards from the south of the United States. Each of the elements represent a particular idea that is collected and attached as like a memory of the person who used to own this memory yard, and it's for water in the end. It's not a kind of water, it's special water. Or you have this is from an article from the New York Times. It's found in 1700 Maryland in the attic in a house that showed this X-ray that nails inside a container pouch. And it just on the left is a photograph from that you can find in the article in the New York Times. And it's in the right, the schematic of the object. They use nails, and this is in during the time of slavery in the U.S. that pretty much prove the tradition of Nkisi, Kondi, and Pungu continue, not just in Cuba, in places like U.S. But the modern dilemma, it had to do what I call the Picasso syndrome, or the second one is the reverse anthropology. We, when we think about Picasso, we think we have the right to talk about African tradition, to appropriate African visual form, iconography, and we use for the sake of modern art, Western art, and it's fine, it's perfect, legitimate, gesture, and it's good. It's not good for African art, but it's good for Western art. That is fine, and I don't have a problem with that. But what you can see here, Moses' mask can be used in his painting. They are pretty much throughout the whole Africa. They are not really specific. No way you can understand the agency of this particular mask in a specific cultural context in Africa. Just give you the sense of all the masks he used through his, making his masterpiece, Le Mignon, On the right is a friend of mine, a colleague, Enrique Chagoya, who talk about the reverse process. What he called reverse anthropology. Is African people, or African, this represent an African people, in this case an African culture, as a symbolism of an African or African descendant destroying or taking, cannibalizing Western, or in this case, Picasso. And that means the questions posed by Enrique Chagoya they have to do with the way in which you can use Western artistic sensibility to talk about an African thing. We never even think that is a possibility. And I think it's one of the questions he posted in that particular, he's a painter, but pretty much is a painter that raised an important critical questions about the way in which we deal with visual language and in the diaspora produced by African descendants. But another example on the left, this is a piece in Kisi from Suriname, and was took from the Amazon, and it's part of the Peabody collection at Harvard, and was then returned back in the 80s by two professors of the archaeology department. You can see pretty much the similarity between the Nkisi and Kondi on the left, and from Suriname, and the one on the right, pretty much the same tradition of Nkisi and Kondi, and somehow managed to continue in the diaspora. What you can see here at the moment of two professors from Harvard is returning now the object, the photograph. It's an interesting photo because they're not giving back the object, they're giving a replica, even not a replica, a photograph of the real object. And the sign of happiness of Samaka is the group that used on that piece. Pretty much what you can see here is the way in which these ideas resonate in contemporary art. And the first one on the top, the first three, they are historical Congo art. The far one is a Cuban artist, Tania Bruguera, who decided to imitate this Congo tradition by using images from a coffee table book that doesn't have to do anything with Congo traditions and the way Congo tradition represent their own cultural practice in Cuba. It's just presenting this as an interesting dilemma. We've been celebrated by many art historians as an important gesture, but doesn't have to do anything with the Congo tradition in Cuba. And on the top and the bottom, you can see all the idea of piercings and nailing from Egyptian, from antiquity, all the way to the dolls in Cuba. Pretty much the conceptual continuity is very clear in the second register. The Green Room. In 2009, I was invited to the Cabernet in Paris with having a conversation with George Marcus. And he came across with this very pompous, convoluted title. But I think what he tried to say at that time was this, to me, in the conversation, was the problem of the crisis in anthropology as a discipline, and how we feel, what is our responsibility in to solve this problem. And one of the things, and I think this is a good thing, I think our history is in a great position to help anthropology as a discipline. But this is what I think is the new direction for anthropology. And this idea of the Green Room as a metaphor of the World Trade Organization is a real green room when everyone gets together to solve the problem. I think the 21st century, the problem with diversity, the diaspora had to be solved like in the Green Room, that everyone agreed. There's not contradiction. Is everyone already know the problem in anticipations? Everyone understand the final, how to perform the final, problems through institutions. A commitment and attention to the audience, in this case, to the subject we wanted to present the diaspora. Field work, and I think the artists in the 21st century, they are field work like ethnographer. And there's a new artist of the 21st century, they invest a lot of time doing research in order to become an artist. Pretty much is what I think is the future of anthropology, to migrate to writings, art critics, and art theory, and an ethnographic understanding of the field work. But this is a real green room. That is the Nganga Ngudia is, so that would be horror translated into English like a medicine man, but I just give you the photograph. This is from Amman, 19th century. This is from the market. You can buy all the ingredients to empower the Kisi. And this is all the medicines, the more than 67 already classified title of what they do and the combination between them. There's a real green rooms. Marcus never talk about it. But what I call a general discourse, and I think about in the present day, how we talk about a specific African tradition when you are working from, defined by modern practice and modern sensibility. And this is a Cuban artist who very versed in African traditions, initiated. But he have a problem, so how he can talk about African tradition, which audience is the one will read this material, will understand what he tried to say. And he created a very interesting strategy. He outlined one of the deities from the Congo tradition. Saravanda is the god of iron, cutting edge, god of technology. And, but doesn't have a representation because Congo tradition in Cuba do not believe in representation. That is one of the problems. We never talk about this kind of thing. And the status of representation in each specific religions in Cuba is the case of Cuban artists. He's creating an image of a religion that doesn't believe in those images to begin with. And that could be seen as a sign of transgression or embracing a way to recognize these African traits in Cuban culture as a whole. But also he used a graphic writing system in Cuba called firmas to embody, to define, and this is the firma that define all the quality of this god, Saravanda. And also he used Kikongo, Creoles in Cuba, and Spanish to define the name, using a free way to represent. It's more like a tautology in a way that Joseph Kosu did with this incredible piece. It's one masterpiece of conceptual art, using the photo, the actual object and definition from the dictionary. When you go to Bedia, is what you have is the verbal notation in Spanish and Kikongo. You have the outlines of creating a morphology to something that doesn't exist, and using the graphic writing system as a third way to define the same concept. What Robert Farris Thompson described is as equalitarianism. And there is Mfuanani, there's a concept in Kikongo that believes in multiplicity, but not multiplicity because wanted to represent the whole as multiplicity, because show different way to understand one single thing, not as a complement of each other. That is very Congo mindset, and it's pretty much what's happening here, not as a holistic approach, more as a possible understanding. And just an example of Congo art, just the graphic tradition, we never even talk about it. This is Bebé from Haiti, Ponto Riscado from Brazil. Just an example of graphic writing tradition used. This one I took my student to Brazil in 2005. One from Cuba, just give it a sense. And the Bebé from Haiti, just give an example of this graphic tradition as a way to talk about, have access to history and visual culture as a conceptual venue to understand African form. Thank you very much.
Slap our cheeks, I know.
Yeah, I got just a quick one about the links between that crucifixion you showed, the early crucifixion.
We can't hear.
Sorry, I was just asking about the connections between the crucifixion, the early crucifixion model you had, and the nail fetishes. I mean, because there's this theory
That one from the one in Haiti?
No, the Congo nail fetish that you put next to the Agno crucifixion.
I put the Congo and kissing Congo.
Yeah.
Oh,
I was just wondering, is it no shelter who has the theory that the Congo nail fetishes started to really be developed and after contact with Western depictions of the crucifixion and martyrological images of penetration like St. Sebastian. And I was wondering what your line on that was. religious icons of multiple penetration by mental objects as fetish objects?
That was the question. Yeah. Okay. This particular object, specifically the crucifix, the problem we have as our historian is when we talk about an object that have any kind of power, we believe in somehow that religious object have a power. It could be a spiritual power or historical power. But when we add this connotation is a religious object, that means there had to be a power that is almost impossible to grasp and understand. Specifically, we understand through the Bible and the history of the crucifix what the object can do in Western sensibility and Western tradition. But we never really, no one explained how this power take place, how you create the power inside the object. No? People believe it's through the power of image in the crucifix. No? And one way to access it, to understand the mechanism in which that crucifix operate in Western mindset. But when we go to talk about Nkisi Nkondi, the one with the nail that's similar to the nails, no one really explained. The most important anthropologist, Wyatt McGuffey, wrote like 3 books about Nkisi Nkondi and Congo tradition, Congo custom, but he never explained how the power get inside the object and how the power manifests through the object. That's still a puzzle or a problem for anthropologists and our historians, because what they do is they describe like a series of recipes. This is the Nkisi that can make you fly or make you think about. It's the one made you to have dreams and save you when dying and so forth. And this is you classify them earthy one, air one, water ones, and all this kind of classification. But no one really look inside the object and see what is inside, what is the materiality aside of the actual form of the object, the aesthetic of the object, one thing. This is what I wanted to compare the aesthetic of the object, because they're very different. What I need to understand the conceptual aspect of the object, how you empower the kneeling. Using the nails in the Nkisi Nkondi operate in two levels. It's like a mnemonic device, because you record who have access to the object, no? Because each nail have a particular design that represent a problem and a decline that go to that. But the second function of the nails is seal a medicine that much your problem as an individual. And that medicine had to be preferred by an expert who understands who you are and how to solve the problem, and that goes inside the object and the object. But no one really explained how this medicine and who combined that. What I did is when I went to the review, I wanted to send to the lab. I asked a friend of mine who used to be a curator, said I wanted to send to the lab. And the lab gave me results of the ingredient. I know the ingredients, I know how you combine them and what they do, but I never have the access to what was inside of Nkisi. I mean, for me, I can explain the Nkisi in a completely different way, because now I understand the medicine and what they do when you combine together. When I saw the crucifix, I saw the text. I said, look, there's a resemblance to Nkisi Nkondi method, but I didn't have a proof. I asked Charlie, can I send it to the lab to see if the fact in the hole has been sealed by the tag, there is something, or it's just an aesthetic thing. And the result was positive. That made me rethink my relationship with this object. If I read in this object as a quintessential example of Christianity penetrating in Africa, that is, that reading is very limited. If I see this as a negotiation, in aesthetic level, is a negotiation, represent a negotiation with Western Christianity, but at a conceptual level, is a clear Congo object that is operating within the Congo principles. But you don't have a way to understand that until you have a complete information of the object. But you can interrogate the materiality of the object, you cannot interrogate the iconography of the object, and you compare with all the I compare with all the crucifixes at the time. There are 3 characters in the crucifix from that time you never will find in Western Christianity, and the way being depicted in them. They have to do with the specific oral tradition in the common tradition that is great at the time of this conversion to Christianity, that made this crucifix more complex and that have a different way to embrace local history as well, Western tradition. But when you look at the object, look like a typical friolized, an example of syncretism, transculturations, but the object doesn't really is beyond that particular reading of the object. That is what and if you think about Ferrari from 1910, it's different from the Ferrari from 2013, no? But we are somehow with the idea of Ferrari from 2013 had to match the ideal. We have a Ferrari from the beginning of the century. If you start looking resemble, you never will find it. You will say, well, this tradition never continued because you are looking at very epidermis, superficial thing. But you are trying to understand the principle in which that object was constructed. It's a completely different horizon. And you open up the object to different reading that go beyond, ideology, political situations, and even the problem in history and legacy. How you can have a legacy and how this legacy can be put back together. What is the system that allowed to a former slave to reorganize their own life and bring back that memory of, before being enslaved from their, ancestor back into history, and how that history mattered? What kind of visual Earth society had to be in place to allow to that history to come back to the surface? It couldn't be just political act, it had to be something else. And I think art gives us a tremendous opportunity to deal with this material in a completely different way. And we can talk about issues of ideological limitation in history, but we can talk about art also at the same time without thinking they contradict each other.
Maybe this is a good moment to bring everyone up.
Yeah.
About 20 minutes.
Yes.
Maybe I'll just sort of begin by, it seems like the 2 things have emerged here. One is the kind of use and reuse of objects, whether it's in Derek and I'm just wondering about what, it seems like one of the things that sort of binds the panel together is the way people have thought about the use and reuse of images. Particularly around perhaps the concept of fetishism. We've heard, for example, Marcus and Barbaro use them in very different kinds of valences. So I'm wondering if there is a way to connect these kinds of things, or are they simply in different universes? The kind of appropriated object that acquires power for the oppressed versus those that turn the stocks into a theme park.
I think fetish theory or fetish discourse is very complicated in our area, because obviously you've got Western constructions of the fetish in Africa. It's originally a Portuguese word, right? Magic with a fetish. But then you've got superscribed on that things like Marxist commodity fetishism, which is taking pejoratively the concepts of the primitive African fetish and projecting it onto capitalist notions of money as magic, primitive magic, which complicates everything. Yeah. And then you've got sexual pathology in fetish.
Excuse me.
Sorry,
The
you can't.
microphone.
Then you've got sexual.
If people could talk
Yeah.
slightly slower, I think
Okay.
we might be able to understand.
Okay, well, I was just saying, fetishistic discourse is highly complicated. You have basically 3 levels of it. You have Western constructions of the primitive fetish in Africa. You have a whole series of discourses related to Marxist appropriations and translations of that African primitive that European construction of primitive African fetish theory. And then you have another whole series of discourses that we all work with around sexual pathology, and those also interface with commodity fetishism. So how you negotiate those is complex.
Yeah. But in general, when I try to address the issues about fetish or fetishism, I always wanted to know the etymology of the word. When who used it first? The etymology. I always wanted to know the etymology of the word. Who used it first? What was the reason? And how far it will go in time. And from that, you can go to these phases in which that particular term, gains different connotations. And the idea is the 14th century, old 14th century definition of fetish is something like handmade or ready-made. That is what they mean of fetish, and associated with carpentry and labor work in an old Portuguese term. When you apply that to African art, specifically in Central Africa, when the definition of making art is associated with the function, like someone like a carpenter, it's made this term very complicated. Like, Mpungwa Buntu is the term to Congo people use for art, and it's the art of putting things together. That is not too far from the definition of term. But when you are reading that in relation to historical context or mode of production, take this definition out of the artistic environment in which that concept have a meaning, and that I think is when everything starts getting messy in the field, because we don't never use term how African people, what kind of term they use for art, what kind of term they use for image, what kind of term they use for learning. We never give the kind of agency to the African language to be in this academic discourse to begin with. And I think we have to start doing that to not just recover this term, just to be responsible with the field work and be more close to the way in which those terms can have a history in the Western thinking, but also is on how can contradict the way in which those the terminology being used in a specific, informed by a specific experience in the field work. That is.
Well, do you think fetish is past its sell-by date as a concept, that we should abandon it in relation to Africa?
I think so. Yeah, I think. Also, now we use fetish to talk about mobile addiction to TVs and televisions and smartphones, and it's just get out of control. They use that term, and if we have to be very conscious of the way in which we use the term, and we have to highlight to a long series of footnotes the transformation of that particular term. It's the only way around if you want to say using that term, or you have to be very clear at using this term. But otherwise, the term is so powerful as a definition that take away what you wanted to do. Just the fact that using the term can cloud what you wanted to do. I think it's
thing to add, I would know this is a slightly different area than dealing with. Deborah, any comments about overuse or?
Well, we know that just looking at how people abuse the black female body in images is part of this whole aspect of fetish, and it continues today with this. You didn't get a chance to do your hip hop aspect of it, but it's still part of that aspect, and I really believe it is a term we need to unpack in different levels. And I never thought about I didn't know the Portuguese term in terms of the 14th century, but I think it's something that we should unpack and reconsider.
I've done some work on trying to globalize the history of Christianity. And I'm always struck that words like syncretism are never used when Christianity is coming out in a Celtic mode or in a Byzantine mode. It's only used for Africa, maybe for parts of Asia. So one of the things that maybe in the academy we need to start doing is to use those words when we're referring to European origin cultures as well, to kind of take the sting out of them. Because I think this is very much goes with the discussion this morning of who controls the narrative, whose experience is normative, and therefore doesn't need a hyphenation and doesn't get words like syncretism and hybridization, because we're the ones, who's we, setting the terms. So to me, there may be a role for broadening the use of some of those terms, the same way that we now hyphenate European American, as a way of trying to change the narrative.
No, I think you are right. But even in African art in general is made less than a quarter of our market, and sort of increased to less than 30% of the profit that comes from African art. But the other thing is one economic factor you have here. When you have, I think I was talking with Marcus before about Black British artists who made it into the mainstream Tate exhibition, like Chris O'Feely. There's a kind of idea, I made it, and I closed the door behind it, and I don't want to, I joined this exclusive club. It's also, we need to address those issues that had to do with ethical behaviors, and not just from the institutional point of view. Institutions set up the rules and say, if you embrace us, you are recognizing this long history and legacy.
Well, that's really interesting, because Chris O'Feely in Britain would never be described as a syncretic artist. He'd been described as a postmodern Brit artist.
But in England, you have a African descendant that have a black artist who have connection with Africa, and a black artist who have connection with Africa. And still the tension right now in contemporary British art. The status of an artist that have a Jamaican, connection is lower than an artist that can claim the pedigree and connection with Africa as a whole. And this is the way the institution believes somehow one is better than the other one. And it's somehow that go into the behavior and conscious decision many of the artists, made in order to be part of this machinery. And if you're an artist in Africa, you don't have African institution deciding things for, who is the next artist. They've always been filtered by biennials and events in like Tate, this Altamore, and this is a new show that will be equal for everyone. Everyone will be at the same playing field, but they didn't have it. They didn't accomplish that. And somehow, I didn't see an exhibition from another institution in Africa at the time to say, okay, let's maybe do a different way, a different show that doesn't have to oppose to that, because it's the way sometimes we've been built. Tate or this hegemonic institution make a move, we had to do something to counter that. Just do another, to make a statement that you have a different understanding of the same issue. But even we don't have even that. We don't have those examples in artistic practice in the present day. We don't have alternative from the periphery deciding who is in, who is out. Even in the home country, we don't sometimes value the home artists. That is one of the problems. You have places like Cuba, many of the artists completely ignored for many years. You had to wait for a European institution to endorse the artist, and after that, the art historian in the country decide, okay, this artist, deserve to be studied, deserve to be, recognized as important. This kind of behavior also does not just repeat in the European context, so have an incredible implication in the way institutional behavior in places like the Caribbean. We are still somehow waiting for what is in our news of foreign flash art to respond, to accommodate our understanding of art in relation to what is in fashion in those institutions. And it still, for me, is a very perversive. I grew up waiting for this magazine to see what was new in the art market, what's new in New York, and accommodate my work to that. I think we need to change that in order to be. But the second problem, I was talking before, the way we use the two terms when we refer to a specific geographic area. When we think about picturesque, we think about something that takes place in Latin America and the Caribbean. When we think about sublime, it's just an American and European thing. We've never been seen, it's very difficult to find the term sublime to describe artistic landscape painting in the 19th century in Latin America. It's almost impossible to find it. There is a tension, even within the academic writing, between what we recognize as picturesque and what is, sublime have a religious connotation at the end embedded in these religious, filters. That's the picturesque do not have. And still, we're still struggling now. The structure of a landscape painting in Brazil, at the same time of the sublime, and they are built, they're being constructed in exactly in the same way. But we are still calling one picturesque and the other one is sublime. There's another problem within the power of academia, how legitimize a particular ideological charter term that is somehow made this clear distinction what is in, what is high art, and what is not, or what is low art. And I think still we have to, it's our responsibility as an art historian, deal with representation, images, and all this, to try to solve the problem, to clarify through our writings and commitment with the student and so forth.
Thinking about the sublime, and I think sublime comes into Jamaica with Frederick Edward Church. You have to get rid of slavery before you can have it. So I think there is a sense that the sublime is too scary a concept to even manage while there's slavery. And that would be where I would start with that. So I think that there is some ways to think about historiographically the way things get avoided, not just because it's Eurocentric, but because things really are too scary to envision. So picturesque is a nice, contained kind of term. So in some ways preserving what your insight and historicizing that, I think, is the name of the game. So. Well, let me just ask one question here as a kind of devil's advocate to folks that are working on, I will ask those of us who say photographs by African American photographers, arts of Congo, where is the place in the study of these kinds of things for critique? The kind of critique that many of us working on Western art as Westerners give Western painting. So you said you didn't want to kind of deal with ideology, but where is there a place to actually assess in sort of a critical way things that work, things that don't?
The critique is there. I think the discovery has happened. So the work now has a reference, and the critique is there in many ways, and that through the exhibition publications of 19th century images, when I discuss some of these images, I'm often critiqued in a sense where I'm looking at not only the description, but also asking the question about hypersexuality or hypermasculinity, and most 21st century audiences take it for granted that we know that this is human. We know these are not subhuman. So why are you showing these images about beauty? And so my critique is a little different, where I'm trying to explore the idea of how do we enter a discussion about beauty that has never been part of a discussion of Black women. I mean, that's never been in terms of art history, within photographic history. So it's a way of, like Carrie Mae Weems is actually critiquing, but also recreating a new history, a new way of reading some of these images. And I see it a lot in Black British artists are considering it through ways of how to use images from the Caribbean and the whole aspect of memory and longing. And so the critique starts, it's a different way of reading it from the Caribbean. We were just had a class where we were talking about redemption song and how do we look at the lyrics and the text from Bob Marley's Redemption Song and then the images of slavery and emancipation. So where's the redemptive value in how to reread manhood and the voice through that? So I think the critique goes across disciplines through through literary texts and through the actual aspect of the aesthetics and the visual. So the critique, I think, is there. I'm reading, a lot about it.
I'm interested. What do you think of
Wait,
Carol
just a
Walker?
second. I'm just going to check with Tony. Do we have time to? Okay. All right.
Well, I think Kara Walker, her new piece on the Harper's Weekly, as she's looking at the images of Harper's Weekly and inserting the images, a different narrative about Black women specifically, but also land and plantation. So she's critiquing the lack of images that shows the complexity of the Black female body in the 19th century Harper's Weekly or Leslie's Illustrated. So she's actually confronting that.
Even going back to images and photography in postcards, what you have is a 19th century and early 20th century postcard being produced in 19th century and late 19th century, early 20th century postcards being produced, prints in Europe. Photo come from African subject. You have an interesting way to have photo that depicting a particular cultural event. The worker or officer from the army believe is important to send as a kind of memory back to their family. But the other side of the postcard, all of the postcards have encryptions that tell you more about the domestic life of a European subject in Africa. That when I did something in the Smithsonian a long time ago, translating postcard from officers from the army, they send it back to the families and relatives back in Europe. An incredible photo that tell you, an an object that doesn't exist anymore, you can use as a kind of historical record of a religious object that is different now. But in the back, you will have access to this private life that almost impossible, like a domestic life, that is almost impossible to have access because we never pay attention to the other side of the postcard. That open a completely new horizon to talk about the psyches of the European worker in a colonial context and why they choose that photo versus the other one. What the inscriptions tell you about what they think about their subjectivity and psychological disposition to the subject they're already living in. And that is an example of the material primary sources where you have like contemporary artists like David Hammond. He have a series called Spiritual Writing. He borrowed the writing from Pentecostal in Jamaica and he turned into abstract painting. And you will find this type of energetic writing in Jamaica. You will find it in the south of the United States. But he's very conscious of choosing a particular visual form that resonates with the spiritual history in the country, that bring back into the question of spirituality and what is the place of spirituality in the visual, in contemporary art, and how you do that through the visual.
Do I need that? I guess this question is primarily for Barbara. Feel free to jump in if you want. Does the scholar of presentation not contemporary
I don't think the mic is on.
is it working? Does the scholar of presentation in Latin America? And I'm of course very interested in this whole issue
I sympathize with your skepticism and the problems associated with some of these terms, which in a sense have been created to provide a rhetorical solution to the conflicts that surround the formation of national cultures in these places. My question then is, what is the alternative? What do we do when we talk about the work of Australia or people like that? Can we, on the one hand, again, I realize that problems in terms with theoretical propositions such as regionalization, syncretism. What would be the alternative? What would you suggest we do?
Very good question. I've been asked, last week I'm opening a show in LA, in the California African American Museum, of a Cuban artist, 50 years of his work, and Rachel also working in the project with me. And there's someone who worked with Yoruba traditions for 50 years. And one of the collectors went to the show and told to me, I think Mendive work is syncretic, and I want you to tell me how syncretic, what means syncretism in his work. But she was imposing on me. I had to agree with her. But that was one of the problems. For me, the best way to start dealing with those terms is to understand how those terms are defined. And they are very different. Hybridity is very different from syncretism and transculturation and creolization. And I use it sometimes without the care we should have with those terms. We had to understand the way those terms being used and constructed in the regional context. And from that, if we want to talk about syncretism, of course, you can refer to an artist, that particular piece of work, talk about issues of syncretism, and you can highlight the different cultures merging together to create a visual form. He's not clear. In this case of this artist, he's searching for an ideal Yoruba visuality that doesn't exist in Cuban art. He's inventing that. And searching is more important than finding that visual form. No, that is kind of the way I presented that. That processing I can describe as a syncretic one. But when you go to a specific language of the painting, and how this painting is constructed, you have to be specific. If he's using an applique that is built into the history of tapestry, European tradition, that applique is giving a reading to that image. You have to address that. And the history of that particular type of art form had to be unfolded in front of you. Where he's co-opting the applique technique to talk about an African subject. When you start to explain the way in which that Yoruba religious imagination take place through the visual, that is, it's a very difficult thing. But it's when you start unfolding the specificity of the visual form, rather than to say this work is 100% syncretic. 100. I think those terms they could be very useful, but you had to explain the context of how those terms will operate in the reading a particular work of art. If you're dealing with tapestry that is built, in a milk, saw into a milk in Belgium. But how you do that? You get an original digital photograph, you have to translate into the language of the tapestry, they had to approve by the artist, and the process of collaboration had to be unfolded. How collaboration is defined in Yoruba context, is that is a concept that exists, or is that European, Western thing? All of these things, but you had to present it to the audience, otherwise you miss, when you made the generalization, this work is syncretic, you turn away all the different layers of negotiation which operate into the work. And that I think is, for me, to try to find a new term, I think is useless for me now. It's just to be more conscious the way you want it to use. If you're talking about syncretic, is the processing of work, how he work, or how he borrow from images from different traditions and try to create a new one, by understanding how syncretic is defined in the first place. And if we believe syncretic is a third party that Fernando Ortiz believed in the definition of syncretism, that the two parties that merged to become the third one, they lose who they are to begin with. That is the definition, and the molten pot is belief in somehow you sacrifice you used to be before to become this third venue, because that third venue is better. It's like the idea of Bimo and Mulatto in Cuba. The idea is to have the best from the whites and the best from the black. And somehow this idea of mulatres is built into this idea of syncretism. This third entity is better because it has the best from both sides. You had to forget who you used to be before to become this new thing. That is a very ideological, problematic definition placed by Fernando Ortiz. And also he's, in the moment, he's thinking Cuban society is defining a new identity at that moment. But when you start thinking about why and the historical moment in which he used syncretism, and you apply out of context in the 21st century with Mendive, is that the discussions about national identity in Cuba in the present day, they are very different from the time Ortiz using the term, and also being put in place by Malinowski in the academic scenes. But we have to be very conscious of the way those terms went from one place to the next, how we use them. You can say maybe syncretic in this moment, in this particular example, is used in these and these and these examples. But I cannot generalize to the entire practice of the artist, because you take away this possibility to read African traits through modern sensibility. This is what we try to do. I believe there is a way you can co-opt Western form of art and talk about an African thing. It's possible. Picasso did reverse. We can do it.
Just on the debate, just to say very quickly on that debate, it is really a very important debate. There is the debate is, as you all know, not recent, but in the 1960s and 70s in the Caribbean, influenced by Ortiz transculturation, but also influenced by an argument around creolization, which was really very, very important. A female theorist looking at dance called Sylvia Winter debunked both and began to say that what we needed to do was think about the question of indigenization, using Jean-Pierre Smear's work in Haiti and thinking through Senghor and Césaire, began to think about, okay, what does it mean when the African, she was thinking about dance primarily, she was thinking about jungle. What does it mean when the African begin to, in fact, reinterpret their own experience of being in the Caribbean through African eyes, but which may also have body movements and so on, that you can say, okay, those look like European. Or that the African, or that voodoo or balloon in Haiti has a certain similarity to all these saints in Catholicism. And therefore the question of, okay, a certain kind of adaptation that allows them not to become a third person, but to become a first person that is reorganizing their cosmology and therefore their identity in a specific space, because that's what they have to work with, becomes a really important way to think about it. And she calls it indigenization. Indigenization, as opposed to creolization, which allows power that you're out there, or transculturation, which then allows you to become this third person, or syncretism, which then allows this third person. But I want, could we, are we all right? All right, let's take Professor Musto the last question and try and make one. Very quick, because we're running out of in front. Behind you, I'm sorry.
It was going to be a question, but because the time is short, it'll just be one of those things where you comment and say afterwards. But I wanted to say that both in the presentation by Barbara and the presentation by Deborah, I know something very important, which is an attempt, more than an attempt, to get these things interpreted and discussed through the eyes of a different set of people, and therefore through the language of a different set of people. And I think it's very important. There's not just a different gaze, as we say, but if it's coming from internally to a set of people who are creating the images or deploying the images or creating the art, then it becomes an important question: whose language do you get to use? And the question that I was going to ask of Barbara is to talk about the complexities of using Kikongo terms to describe and work through an aesthetics of Kikongo art, as opposed to any of these other terms. But because we're out of time,
Okay. Yeah, we can
say thanks very much to all the panelists. Thanks to the chair, Di. Really, thank you very much.